Welcome back, America. It's Hugh Hewitt. Thank you for listening to the Hugh Hewitt Show. A few days ago, I said after Mitt Romney talked about global warming in response to a town hall question, I wished my friend Stephen Hayward of the American Enterprise Institute would do a draft Q&A for the benefit of every Republican running for office so that they can sail between the Scylla and Charybdis of appearing to be against science and at the same time not embracing onerous, ridiculous, economy-killing regulatory regimes. He has done so at powerlineblog.com in a marvelous Q&A, and he joins me now. Hello, Stephen. How are you?
Good, Hugh. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you, by the way. That is a marvelous post.
Well, thanks.
What is the response to it out there? Because a lot of conservatives don't want to hear that the Earth has been warming about a degree since 1900.
Well, it's been a mixed response, as you might expect, even though I post a little note at the end saying, please try and grasp the point of what's going on here, which is how politicians should talk about this in an election campaign and not simply trying to win debates on all the fine points. And there's a million fine points to this subject. But I've gotten a steady stream of emails and comments throughout the day saying, good, not so sure, or why do you concede even an inch to these crazy green people? So, maybe it's the old saying, and maybe I'm in the right place, right in the middle of all this.
Well, you are, and I think you immediately grasp what I see as the challenge here, which is how do you talk about something so that you do not communicate indifference to science, but you also don't communicate allegiance to crackpot policy?
Well, that's not easy to do because the environmentalists especially enforce a rigid orthodoxy on the subject, such that if you do not toe exactly their line, they brand you as a denier or something like that. So, I mean, any politician who says what I recommend in my piece, which is essentially, this isn't quite right, but let the science take care of itself and let's talk about policy. And no matter what the scientists say, the policy prescriptions of the environmental movement are idiotic, and we don't want to do that. And it seems to me that's where the political debate is won on all this.
Have you, a different way of asking this is, have you heard anyone yet on the Republican side, even down to the level of senators who aren't running or congressmen in leadership positions, talk about the global warming / climate change controversy well?
No, not very many. There's a couple who I think get some pieces of this. Devin Nunes, the Republican House member from up north of you in California, he's got some sensible ideas on energy innovation, which are partly related to the climate question. John Shadegg, who just left the House, unfortunately, after this last election, didn't stand for re-election. He understands this pretty well and talks about it sensibly, but there aren't very many, unfortunately.
All right, now let's walk through the Q&A, and the long version is over at powerlineblog.com. with Stephen Hayward. Before I do that, let's credential up, though, Stephen. Tell people you've done a film on this, you've done a book on this, you know this stuff.
Yeah, unfortunately, I tried to avoid climate change for years because I've worked on traditional environmental issues for a long time because it's such a black hole. But starting 6-7 years ago, I dived in with both feet because you just have to these days. It's the leading environmental issue of our time, unfortunately.
And so how would you, let's start with, do you believe, this is the audience on Monday night, John King looks up and says to all the Republicans, how many of you believe that climate change is taking place? Raise your hand. Should the Republicans raise their hand?
Yes, they should. There's two ways of looking at it. One is the climate always changes. I mean, that's the history of the Earth for 4 billion years, right? Secondly, we got pretty good information that the Earth has warmed a bit over the last century or so. We don't understand it fully. A lot of the reasons could be natural. Some of them, many of them could be man-made. It's not been that dramatic yet. The environmentalists, of course, take the smallest little change and immediately make catastrophe out of it. But I think there's no reason to try and deny that the climate has warmed at all. And as I point out, even Sarah Palin, because you see these effects most visibly in places like Alaska, even Sarah Palin agrees with that.
And so how much has it warmed, and hasn't it actually gotten cooler in the last 10 years?
The last 10 years, temperatures have been about flat. They've really been in the margin of error. But yes, after 2 decades of steadily warming temperatures, suddenly things flattened out the last few years, and that's increasingly a problem for the climate alarmists. We've warmed about 0.8 of 1 degree Celsius over the last 100 or so years. And
so, Stephen Hayward, do you agree that humans have caused climate change? This is the second question in your sort of model press conference over at Powerline Blog.
I think there's considerable evidence that we've had some effect on all this. Although, what the balance is I think we're still a long way from really knowing.
And so when you say that, is there any guilt on our part for having impacted the temperature rise?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, the trade-offs for The development of modern energy, which has meant fossil fuel energy, are enormously positive. Look, the energy use is directly implicated to the rising prosperity of the entire world, and without it, our life expectancy would be about half what it is today. We'd be a lot poorer, and by the way, there would be fewer of us. I sometimes tell college kids, how many of you think we should be using 80% less energy? And I answer that to half of you just raised your hands wouldn't be here if we were actually live that way.
Stephen Hayward is my guest. We'll continue this conversation after the break. Don't go anywhere, America, except perhaps to powerlineblog.com to begin reading and memorizing Stephen Hayward's very important post on how to talk about climate change if you're a Republican when we return to the Hugh Hewitt Show. Welcome back, America. It's Hugh Hewitt, joined by Stephen Hayward, whom you know is a biographer of Ronald Reagan for his epic 2-volume history of Ronald Reagan. He's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and he's a contributor to the Powerline blog. But I know him as well as just an old friend and an expert on global climate change, arguments, alarmism, and generally the science. He wrote today over at powerlineblog.com. I've linked it at hughhewitt.com. A very important post that is advice to how Republicans running for president ought to talk about climate change. I'm walking through some of it. The next question you pose and ask and answer, Stephen Hayward, is if you agree that human activity has played a role in the recent warming of the planet, why don't you support cap and trade emissions reductions, the UN agenda, putting a price on carbon, or pick another form of this answer? What's the answer to that?
Right. Well, those are all a really bad idea. What the environmental movement has demanded is one answer to this purported problem, which is essentially phase out fossil fuel use in a very short timeline, and a completely unrealistic timeline. And the problem with it is we simply don't have the substitutes. It's a completely unrealistic agenda. And moreover, India and China and other developing countries have said repeatedly they're not going to go along with that because, as they've told us, essentially, we don't understand you Americans. You can't really expect us to be poor forever. So the Chinese, the Indians, and others said we're going to keep using fossil fuels because we need to develop. And so, for example, China by itself in the next 25 years their emissions will grow by more than the United States currently emits. And what this all means, and this answer is too long for candidacy, but it's important for people to understand this. It means if the United States were to disappear off the face of the earth, it would make no difference to the projections of future warming that climate orthodoxy gives us. And that's why this was never going to work.
And so what should we do?
Let's just use this as a thought experiment, if this is actually a serious problem in the future, which, maybe the alarmists might turn out to be right for a change, although I think it's unlikely. The way to develop solutions to this kind of problem is, one, emphasize resiliency of countries' capabilities to deal with any kind of disaster. Just ask a quick question. We've had 2 huge earthquakes in the last year and a half, one in Haiti and one in Japan. Which country was better able to deal with that kind of calamity, and why? Well, it's obvious what the answer to that is, and the answer is economic prosperity. So you want to emphasize economic prosperity for the whole world, because that builds up everyone's adaptive capacity for all kinds of conditions, whatever the cause. By the way, maybe the world will warm more for natural reasons, in which case we could phase out fossil fuels completely, and it would make no difference. So we want to get richer. We want to get more technically proficient in dealing with changes of any kind. That's a much better policy. And ultimately, if you want to have non-carbon energy, you want to develop new forms of energy that are cheaper than carbon, rather than penalizing fossil fuels by making them more expensive through taxes. We didn't develop railroads by taxing wagon trains, right?
Yeah. Now, let me ask you, again, I'm posing as the hostile press, but the hostile press is sure to answer. How dare you gamble with the future? John McCain even said, why wouldn't we do cap and tax? It's got it's a market-driven mechanism, and wouldn't we want to leave our children a less warm globe if we have that option open to us?
If it had some chance of working, maybe the answer might be yes. But in fact, you'd be spending billions and billions of dollars to have no effect at all. And I think what people ought to do in this, what candidates ought to do, is turn this around and deliberate attack of the environmental movement for delivering us an agenda that won't work, that's too costly, and doesn't even solve the problem on their own terms. They've been irresponsible about this issue for at least 20 years, and some of them are starting to figure it out. It's time to start from scratch instead of simply doing the same thing over and over again.
All right, a reporter puts his hand up and says, well, are you saying that the climate science is all flawed and it's all fraudulent? How do you answer that, Stephen Hayward?
We're trying to predict the future 100 years out, and our track record of doing that is really, really bad. You can go back just 30 years to people who predicted what world conditions would be like in 1980 or even this year, and they're usually wrong, often by orders of magnitude. Just a few years ago, the UN said there would be 50 million climate refugees by the year 2010. Well, guess what? 2010 came and it didn't happen. So the track record on this is really bad, and I don't think we should be handing over massive amounts of political power to governments based on computer models and on some very thin speculations about what conditions are going to be 100 years from now.
Now, Stephen, a columnist in the Sydney newspaper wrote this week in a fairly dramatic column that...
Oh, yeah, I saw it.
Did you see that children are going to stand, accusing their parents for having islands disappear? And I wanted to ask him which islands. And so my question is, how high are the seas going to rise, if at all?
Well, now, here's the funny thing. The official, quote-unquote, climate science of the UN says that the projection for the 20th century, the median projection for the 21st century would be about 17, 18 inches. Well, the sea levels actually rose about 8 to 10 inches during the 20th century, but I don't recall a lot of people saying that's something you really noticed as one of the biggest things that happened during the last century. And by the way, the alarmists are always disappointed when the UN doesn't say what they wanted to say, so they're still saying, well, it's going to be much bigger than that, but they're the ones now running ahead of the science.
And if a reporter puts up their hand and says, do you believe that any of these weather patterns that we're having, tornadoes, typhoons, hurricanes, are at all related to global warming and climate change? What's the answer, Stephen Hayward?
The answer is no, because that's what people at the National Hurricane Center say. That's what most of the experts who study extreme weather events say. Again, if you look into the data on all this, it does not bear out those things. This is called weather. This is hurricane season this year. As you know, out in California, where you're supposed to be having dry winters and less snow, it's still snowing up at Lake Tahoe this week.
So is there anything going on in the climate, and how should a Republican approach this generally?
Well, I mean, I think you want to stick with some basic principles that, one, any solution to any kind of environmental problem has to be compatible with liberal democracy and economic freedom, individual freedom. The problem with the environmental agenda is it's too often authoritarian, wants to take your liberties away, wants to give government more power over resources, and those solutions are not acceptable. I think that's point number one, and I'll just leave it with that one, because that's good enough, I think.
Stephen Hayward, a very important post. I hope everybody reads it. It's at powerlineblog.com. I've linked it at hughhewitt.com, and it's a great public service, and I hope every one of our candidates and all of their staffs and not a few members of the media are passing it around among themselves. Always a pleasure, Stephen. Thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you, Hugh.
When we come back, I'm going to remind you about the Powerline Prize. That's right, the Powerline Prize. You can win $100,000. Whoever most effectively and creatively dramatizes the significance of the federal debt crisis. And I will tell you, there are all sorts of wonderful entries that are flowing in, but I'll give you more details on what you can submit and when you need to submit it by. First prize, $100,000. I feel like Austin Powers and Dr. Evil. $100,000. I'll be right back, America. Don't go anywhere. It's the Hugh Hewitt Show.